Hi, everyone. My name's Rochelle Allen, and I am here to talk to you a little bit today about conjugating VTA verbs in the obviate. So when a third person is doing something to someone else, or when someone else is doing something to the third person. If you watched my previous video on the sort of system that I use when I think about VTAs, you will have already covered these conjugations. All of the I to him or her, we to him or her, they to us. And today we're going to talk about the next step, Obviate, which is using the same system with a few additions. And as I mentioned previously, my way of thinking about VTAs is different than I've seen written down other places. It doesn't rely on a chart as much, and it works piece by piece. So I don't always have the whole conjugation figured out before I start speaking. And I can use the system to sort of think through each piece and very slowly get me to the end. And I just wanted to share it in case it might be helpful to any of you out there, because VTAs are really interesting, and I feel like we shouldn't fear them as much as we often do. So what I did was I took things that already exist. This is pre-existing information, and I just used it in a way that worked for me, and I'm going to share that with you. If you want to look up some of the information, there are terms here that you can use to search in different writings about Anishinaabemowin. And so today we're going to talk about the relationships that can exist here. So if you and I are talking, we're talking about two or more other people and their interaction. So obviate is what I call it. Some people will say the fourth person or other. And it's this really amazing way that Anishinaabemowin takes a story and tells you who they're talking about and how actions happen between them and other people. And it moves around. So, in English, we use word order. Usually the person who's acting goes first, but that's not necessarily the case in Anishinaabemowin. So here we're telling a story, and we got our spotlight on Awia, and this person can have interactions with others, and through the conjugation and through the marking of the other with an N at the end, we can have a really rich description of the scene. And if we wanted to change who we were highlighting, we could just move this little light over and spotlight this person. They would become Awia, and this person would become Awian. And it's really amazing, and fluent people obviously can just go back and forth, and it's so incredible. Learners, it takes us a little while to get comfortable with it, but you definitely can, and we're going to talk about it today. So this is the system that we discussed in the previous video. I have 4 questions for each of the 4 spots in the conjugation. And you can see what we're going to do today is we're going to add 1 piece here and 1 piece here, and everything else is going to stay the same. And one thing you will notice is that this is an N that we're adding, not unlike the N you see here, marking the fourth person, the obviate person. And that marker, as you can see here, also goes on the name or descriptor of that person. So if I'm If you're talking about her and her cat, Conjugation has an AN here, and we know that then it's the fourth person or obviate. One interesting thing to note for a lot of us, if we have singular, we have a wea, and then we'll see an N marking at the end. So you might have, James and Jameson. In the plural, we have a weug, so we might see Conjugation if there's more than one cat. But if it's obviate for a lot of us, the plural marking doesn't show up because we have this obviate marking. And there are some communities that do mark the plural obviate with a glottal. I'm not going to cover that today, but if you're from one of those areas, you would just need to add a glottal option here. Okay, so how do we conjugate this? The first thing is the same as we started in the other presentation. We start with the relationship that's closest to us. And so for this, it's going to be the third person, or he or she, or them singular. And we're going to put an O or a W in this first spot. And that's going to be the same for all obviate conjugations. And you can see here, they all have an O at the beginning. And now you put in your verb, your tenses, all those things, and you're part of the way there, almost half. And so we go to our step 2. And in step 2, all we're thinking about is the third person who is, we put the O here for them. Are they doing to the fourth person, or is a weon or fourth person doing the verb to the third person who's marked here? So I put little arrows to help you remember which is which. If it's third doing to fourth, ig if it's going the other way. So if we look at our two people here, o wabama, o wabamig. And that's all we're going to do in this step. And it is exactly the same as in our other conjugations using the third person. And you can see here, it can go either way, conjugations or igo conjugations. Remember that depending on if the ig were the last letter, it would drop the O. But because we're putting things on afterwards, we're going to see this O return and help fill in the sounds between the next letters. Now we have our third step. And in what we're going to do here is we're just thinking about, is the third person plural? And we don't have to choose between others like non. We know that any plural is not going to include me, the speaker. And so they're all was. So any third person plural for obviate conjugations is going to be a wa. If you don't have a plural, if this is just a single person, then you leave this spot empty. And so now we see o wa bama wa, o wa bamigo wa. So both of these, it's third person plural. So, they are doing to another. In this one, you can see that this spot is left blank. O wa baman. And so we didn't need to put in a third person plural in here because there's singular awea. And I have heard that some places don't use a plural here. So if in your community you don't pluralize anything in the obviate conjugation, you don't need to worry about this step. And you'll have something else that helps you understand if it's more than one person or not. And now we go to our final step, which is adding the N, like we saw at the end of Owian, Conjugation, to the end of our conjugation. And this is the one thing that is a bit different, is all the obviate conjugations do need something in the final spot. And so even if the wa was empty and the fourth person is singular, you still need that obviate marker so that we know what we're dealing with. I did mention that there are some communities who, if they have the obviate person is plural, they'll have a glottal, and you can add that if that's your case. But the ones I'm most comfortable, used to, have the N at the end. And so I don't want to get too much into territory that I'm not up to speed on. So we put our N in our final spot, and now all of the conjugations are complete. Awia sees awian, so you might see something like she sees her grandmother un, owabaman, awian sees awia, owabamigun. And this, like we saw in our igug, when we have this igu with a consonant afterwards, we do sometimes need an extra letter just to help it sound better and not confused with other conjugations. Awian sees awiag, so this might be something like they're seen by the cats. They're seen by their cats. Owabamiguan. And this is just the whole thing all on one slide, so you can practice or double check what I've said. And wanted to show you a few examples. You can pause to go through them in more detail, but what you can see here is we have the O, the ah, and the un. And so this is a singular third person on fourth person. And you can also see here that the fourth person has the obviate marker. So we know just by looking at it that this is the third person dog towards the fourth person cat. And as we know, obviate things, even though I said person throughout this presentation, they don't have to be people, they don't have to be animals, they can be things like potatoes. So, ozaskokwan opinin ao nokomis. So, nokomis is not marked with the obviate, but the potatoes are. And we can see that the action is going from the third person to the fourth person. And again, because the fourth person is the obviate, it's not pluralized. So you don't see potatoes, even though we know from the translation, and probably we would expect, that there's more than one potato. And of course, this is why having our ah and igu straight is really important, because otherwise we would say something like, potato is frying grandmother, which one doesn't make that much sense, but might be an embarrassing thing to say in front of fluent people or people who are more competent speakers. And here we're looking at a conjugation that's going the other way. So the obviate or fourth person is acting on the third. Ojibwe wabamegun eje ayad. And again, there we see that the plural here is left blank. Igun becomes lengthened. So this is how the chart looks all together. So if you're doing all of the conjugations, including the third person, so me to third person, you to third person to us, or if you're talking about obviate, these are the questions you're going to want to ask as you go through. And here are the options you're pulling from. And as with the first presentation, I do have a little app, and you'll find the link to it in the description of the video. And this includes both obviate and the to and from third person conjugations that we worked on in the last video. And you can see again that I've used 3 different ways of discussing, because I know that everybody learned different terminology, and I don't want the English to be the thing that makes tools not useful to people. And you can just go through and you click off the spots to fill in the conjugation. So we have O, the third person, before the verb. And now we can see that it's the they to the other, or the third person to the fourth. And so we have an A. We can see that the third person is plural, so we want to have a wa. And now we add an N for the obviate. Submit it, and it will tell you if you're correct or not, and if it's a conjugation that requires any sound changes, for instance, an AW plus an IG, there'll be a note about that at the bottom here. And I hope that this can be a help to you in practicing these conjugations. Once you get comfortable with the pieces and the way of working through them, it's going to be important to push yourself to write them out fully by yourself or practice using them. Each tool we have for language learning can only get us so far. And so once you've gotten comfortable with it, find another way to challenge yourself in working through these verbs. Thank you so much for joining. I will include links to the app as well as to some other information on obviate conjugations and what it all means in the description, so that you can get other people's perspective, and also so you can continue this part of your learning. I hope that you have great success and look forward to connecting with you again in the future.